He gave up fame for peace. But on this flight, peace wasn't an option. When a commercial pilot publicly humiliated Keanu Reeves at 30,000 feet, no one expected what happened next. What Keanu did in response didn't just shock the passengers, it changed a life forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The early morning haze lingered above LAX, casting a dull glow over the terminal windows as travelers shuffled through the wide corridors of international departures. Among the noise of rolling luggage and overhead announcements, one man moved quietly, unnoticed by most, until they recognized him. Keanu Reeves walked alone, dressed simply in worn jeans, a black hoodie pulled low over his head, and a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. No security, no assistant, no paparazzi. Just the sound of his boots hitting the polished floor and the occasional glance from someone who did a double take, then whispered to a companion, "Is that Keanu?" He offered a few soft nods in return but kept moving. Today wasn't a press day. He wasn't headed to a premiere or award ceremony. It was something quieter, a small film festival in Tokyo, paying tribute to his early work. He'd almost said no to the invite, but there was something about the simplicity of it, the sincerity, that convinced him to go. At Gate 76, a young mother with a toddler balanced awkwardly on her hip was digging through her oversized purse. Her stroller sat collapsed beside her, and her boarding pass had slipped under the seat. As she crouched to grab it, the toddler squirmed and kicked, knocking a folded passport from her hand. It slid across the floor toward Keanu's boots. He bent down immediately, picking it up before it could get kicked or stepped on, and approached her with a gentle expression. She looked up, flustered, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Oh, thank you so much," she said, trying to juggle her purse and baby. "No problem," he said with a small smile. "It's easy to drop things when you're carrying the world." She blinked for a second, then smiled back, suddenly recognizing him. But she said nothing more, just nodded and mouthed, "Thanks." Keanu gave a small nod and returned to the boarding line. Nearby, a man in a crisp pilot uniform stood behind a tinted glass wall, arms crossed, watching. First Officer Dean Carraway's eyes were locked on Keanu. Not in awe, not in admiration, but in something colder. The moment the actor had walked into the terminal, Dean had seen him. He'd seen those quiet, casual movements, the humble energy that people always seem to talk about in interviews. But Dean saw something else, something he'd buried for years, a flash of memory, a hospital room, a younger brother's final breath, and a poster of Keanu Reeves grinning from a motorcycle pinned on the wall like a ghost that refused to leave. Dean's jaw tensed, his fingers curled into fists. To him, this wasn't just a celebrity passing through. It was a reminder, a wound that hadn't healed. He turned before anyone noticed, the look on his face, and walked toward the cockpit, forcing himself to forget the past, at least for now. But some memories don't fade, and some flights don't go according to plan. At the front of the gate, passengers began forming an uneven line as the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Keanu remained near the back, keeping to himself. He didn't mind waiting. He always preferred to let others rush ahead. It was quieter that way. A few rows ahead, the young mother tried to fold her stroller one-handed while holding her restless child. Keanu stepped forward, gently took the stroller, and clicked it shut in one smooth motion. She gave him a grateful look, her eyes tired but soft. "You've done this before?" she asked, smiling faintly. "Not exactly," he replied, "but I've had enough luggage fall apart on me to figure it out." She laughed under her breath, her child finally calming in her arms. As she moved forward in the line, she gave him a final, thankful glance before disappearing into the tunnel toward the plane. The gate agent scanned Keanu's ticket without fanfare. She noticed his name, paused, but didn't comment. She simply smiled. He returned it with a nod and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin was nearly empty. Only 2 other passengers were seated, an older man reading a newspaper and a businesswoman typing rapidly on her tablet. Keanu slid into his window seat, tucked his bag beneath the seat in front of him, and gazed out at the tarmac. The clouds hung low that morning, pale and gray. A fine mist clung to the windows, and the soft hum of engines rolled like distant thunder across the airport. Keanu leaned back, took a quiet breath, and closed his eyes. A moment later, he felt the shift in the cabin, the presence of someone entering with deliberate steps. Dean Carraway strode through the first-class section as part of his pre-flight inspection, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the overhead bins and seat arrangements. When he reached Keanu's row, he slowed, not because of anything technical, but because there he was, the man from the movies. The face he'd seen more times than he could count during the worst year of his life. Keanu opened his eyes and looked up. Their eyes met for a beat too long. Dean didn't speak. He didn't nod. He didn't acknowledge the passenger like he did with others. He just turned slightly, checked an overhead latch, and moved on. Keanu watched him go, something unspoken passing through the silence. A flight attendant standing nearby noticed the tension. She glanced between them, confused. Keanu offered her a polite smile, brushing it off, but she sensed it. Something was off, a quiet friction in the air that didn't belong. Dean disappeared behind the curtain separating first class from the cockpit. Keanu turned back toward the window. The plane hadn't even left the ground, and already something didn't feel right. He couldn't name it, but he would feel it again soon, and much stronger. As the rest of the passengers filed onto the plane, the soft melody of classical music played through the speakers. Keanu adjusted his seat, pulled out a small leather notebook from his jacket, and scribbled a few lines, ideas, for a short story he'd been working on. Writing helped him stay grounded, especially in places like this, suspended between time zones and the noise of the world. A flight attendant named Maria approached, offering him water and a warm towel. She was in her early 30s, composed and professional, but carried a warmth in her tone that felt rare on commercial flights. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reeves. Let us know if you need anything." Keanu looked up, surprised she used his name. "Thank you, and you can just call me Keanu." Maria smiled. "I'll try, but the rest of the crew might not be so casual." He gave a small nod of gratitude. As she stepped away, he glanced toward the cockpit curtain again. He could hear muffled voices, radio chatter, checklist call-outs, routine communication. But for some reason, the air felt heavy. He couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching. Or rather, someone was waiting. In the cockpit, Dean sat stiffly beside the captain, Julia Chen. She'd flown with him before and respected his professionalism, but today something in his tone felt clipped. He stared at the instrument panel, but his mind wasn't on the dials. "You all right?" she asked without turning her head. "Fine," Dean replied quickly. "Just didn't sleep much." She didn't push it, but she noticed the glance he threw toward the passenger manifest. "I saw the name," he added under his breath. "Didn't expect him to be on this flight." Julia raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Reeves." Dean didn't answer right away. "Yeah. He's harmless," she said. "Quiet guy. Doesn't even take selfies with the crew." Dean's jaw tightened. Back in the cabin, the young mother from earlier walked past Keanu, balancing her now sleeping child against her shoulder. She whispered, "Thank you," again as she passed. Keanu smiled, adjusting slightly to give her more room to reach her seat in economy. The cabin filled quickly. A gentle announcement confirmed takeoff in 20 minutes. Passengers settled in, the usual hum of overhead bins closing, and voices dropping into travel mode. Keanu leaned back again, watching the airport crew outside. One baggage handler paused near the wing and glanced toward the plane, doing a double take before smiling to himself and returning to work. Inside the cockpit, Dean was quiet, his hands on the throttle, posture tense. He said nothing more, but his eyes flicked toward the cockpit door once more. Behind him, a cabin full of people carried on with their lives, and in seat 2A, a man known across the world as a symbol of calm and kindness was about to be tested in a way no script could prepare him for. The flight hadn't taken off yet, but the story was already in motion. Keanu remained seated in 2A, quietly sipping the water Maria had brought him. Outside the window, the fog over LAX was beginning to lift. The tarmac glistened faintly under the late morning sun, though the sky remained overcast. Inside the cabin, however, the temperature felt cooler than it should. Passengers continued to settle in, and with each one who walked by and realized who was sitting in the second row, the cabin seemed to hum with an undercurrent of recognition. Whispers moved down the aisle like a subtle wave. People tried not to stare, but they did. A couple in their 60s paused near the row behind him. The woman nudged her husband gently. "That's him," she whispered. "Keanu Reeves. I told you." Her husband leaned in for a better look. "Doesn't look like the movies." "It looks better," she replied softly. They took their seats quietly. A few rows ahead, a middle-aged man in a blazer pretended to check his phone while angling it for a photo. Keanu noticed, but didn't react. He kept his gaze on the window, fingers gently tapping the armrest. Not from nerves, just rhythm. Then came the flight attendant with too much energy in her step. Her name tag read Ashley. She approached cautiously, carrying a tablet in one hand, trying to look professional but clearly starstruck. She crouched slightly beside him. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know you probably get this all the time, but would it be okay if I got a quick photo? Just one. I won't post it anywhere. I just want to show my dad. He's a huge fan." Keanu turned to her gently, his voice low and kind. "Thank you, that means a lot. But I try not to take photos while traveling. It keeps the energy a little calmer for everyone." Ashley nodded, visibly disappointed but respectful. "Of course, I understand." He smiled faintly. "Tell your dad I said thank you." That alone seemed to lift her spirits again. "I will. He won't believe it." She stood and moved on, blushing. Keanu leaned back once more, trying to recenter himself, but the mood in the cabin was shifting. Not because of excitement, because of something else entirely. From the front curtain, Dean Carraway emerged. His steps were sharp, precise. Clipboard in hand, eyes forward, posture rigid. He moved through first class as part of the official walkthrough, checking bins, latches, oxygen masks. But as he neared 2A, he didn't pause, didn't look at Keanu, didn't greet him the way he greeted every other passenger. Instead, he kept moving. Deliberate. Keanu noticed. So did Maria, who stood at the front. Her eyes tracked Dean as he brushed past the row without a word. She looked back toward Keanu, uncertain. Keanu caught her glance, then nodded once to reassure her. He didn't need a warm welcome, but he couldn't deny that something was off. The plane was almost ready for takeoff, but the chill in the cabin had already taken root. Dean continued moving down the aisle, speaking briefly with a few passengers in business class. He offered polite nods, answered a quick question about flight duration, and gave a half smile to a boy wearing plastic pilot wings on his jacket. But when he turned back toward the cockpit, he walked past Keanu's seat again without a glance. Maria met him at the curtain. She waited until they were just out of earshot from the cabin, then spoke quietly. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Dean's eyes flicked toward her, defensive. "Why would there be? You walked past Reeves twice. No greeting, no eye contact. That's not like you." Dean shifted the clipboard in his hands. "I don't greet every celebrity." "But you do greet every passenger," she replied. "I've worked 5 flights with you. You shake hands with toddlers, remember names of honeymooners. What's different now?" Dean looked away for a moment. I just don't think we should treat him any differently because of who he is. Maria didn't press, but her concern didn't fade. All right, I just thought you'd want to know people are watching, and... He noticed. Dean said nothing, slipping back through the curtain. Back in first class, Keanu folded his notebook and tucked it into the seat pocket in front of him. He wasn't agitated, but he was alert. His years in the public eye had trained him to recognize shifts in energy, and this one wasn't typical discomfort around a celebrity. It felt targeted, personal. Ashley returned, a little more composed now, and began offering drinks to the first-class passengers. Still water? She asked Keanu, forcing a smile. He nodded. That'd be perfect, thank you. She handed it to him carefully. Let me know if you need anything else. Really? Her tone was sincere, as if she was trying to make up for something that wasn't her fault. He nodded again and took the glass. A few minutes later, Maria returned to first class with her own tray. She checked on the businesswoman across the aisle, then stopped beside Keanu. Mr. Reeves, we'll be closing the cabin door shortly. We expect a smooth flight to Tokyo today. Keanu looked at her and offered a soft, thank you. She paused, then leaned in just slightly. If there's anything you need, she said in a low voice, please don't hesitate. Keanu held her gaze for a moment. He could tell she was trying to say something without saying it. There was no fear in her eyes, just empathy and quiet warning. I'll be all right, he said gently. She nodded and stepped away. Around him, the cabin was peaceful, but it was the kind of peace that comes before a storm. The cabin door closed with a solid hiss, followed by the faint chime of the intercom. Passengers put away their devices. The safety video began on the overhead monitors. Keanu leaned back in his seat and buckled his belt, eyes calmly tracking the instructions even though he had flown dozens of times before. Behind the calm, his instincts stayed sharp. That pilot Dean was more than just cold. It was as if something deeper was lodged beneath the surface. Not annoyance, not fatigue, resentment. And it had weight. Keanu didn't look for conflict, he never had, but something told him this wasn't going to be an ordinary flight. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Maria passed through the cabin again, checking seatbelts. She offered Keanu a brief, reassuring glance. He returned it with a nod. No words were needed. She was watching too. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Dean adjusted the throttle with clinical precision. Captain Julia Chen monitored the control panel beside him. Cabin secure, she said. Let's roll. Dean gave a brief acknowledgement and began the taxi. But his grip on the yoke was tight, his jaw locked in place. Julia glanced sideways, noticing. Still thinking about Reeves? She asked casually, eyes ahead. Dean exhaled through his nose. I just think it's interesting how some people become legends while others are forgotten. Julia frowned slightly. Did something happen? He didn't respond. You sure you're up for this flight? She asked, serious now. If you've got something personal going on, I need to know. Dean shook his head. I'm fine. Let's just get airborne. Back in first class, Keanu pulled a blanket over his lap and closed his eyes again. Not to sleep, but to center himself. Years of meditation had taught him how to breathe through tension, to sit with discomfort without feeding it. But this wasn't about his own peace anymore. It was about sensing when the energy around him could turn into something more dangerous. A man two rows behind whispered to his partner, "Why's the pilot looking so stiff?" "I noticed that too," she replied softly. "He looked mad when he passed us." The murmurs didn't grow loud, but they echoed what Keanu already felt. Ashley walked by with a tray of snacks, keeping things cheerful, but even her voice had a slight tremble in it now. She paused beside Keanu again. "Still good?" she asked. He opened his eyes, met hers. "All good." She hesitated, then added quietly, "We're all watching out for each other up here." He nodded once. That meant more than she knew. As the aircraft reached the runway and accelerated, The vibration under the cabin rose. First class jolted slightly as wheels lifted off the ground. They were airborne, and though the sky above was clear, what was waiting inside the plane was anything but. Keanu looked out the window, the city falling away beneath him. 30,000 feet above the ground, a confrontation was rising. Slow, silent, and personal. He just didn't know yet how far it would go. At 38,000 feet, the aircraft settled into its cruising altitude. The clouds outside stretched in endless layers, soft and blindingly white beneath the sun. Passengers relaxed. Some reclined their seats, others opened books or closed their eyes for a mid-flight nap. In first class, Keanu remained still, gazing out the window, hands folded. He hadn't touched the in-flight meal, just drank water and kept mostly to himself. Maria had stopped by once more to offer tea, which she accepted quietly. In the cockpit, Dean Carraway watched the storm system forming ahead on the radar. Nothing major, but enough to cause intermittent turbulence. He adjusted altitude slightly and made a brief announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some light chop ahead for the next 20 minutes. Please return to your seats and fasten seatbelts when the sign is on. Thank you." The seatbelt chime echoed through the cabin. As expected, the first few bumps were mild. The plane dipped and rose slightly, a few overhead bins rattled, and some passengers reached instinctively for their armrests. Keanu didn't flinch. He'd been through far worse flights. But he could sense the energy inside the aircraft shift again. The unsettled air wasn't just outside. Then came the footstep. Bean stepped out of the cockpit, this time not with a clipboard, not with polite silence, but with a mission. He moved with purpose, scanning the rows with a tight jaw. His eyes found Keanu instantly. Maria saw him coming and instinctively stood to intercept, but Dean brushed past her. Passengers turned to look. Dean stopped 2 feet from Keanu's seat and folded his arms. "Funny," he said loudly, making no effort to hide his voice. "I always wondered what it's like for spoiled celebrities who buy their way into sainthood." The entire first-class cabin froze. Keanu looked up slowly, calm, his expression unreadable. Dean continued, "Giving up your seat for a pregnant woman, helping an old man at the terminal. A few nice headlines and suddenly people forget everything else, don't they?" Keanu blinked once. "Excuse me?" Dean's tone turned sharper. "I said people love a performance, especially when they think it's real." Passengers exchanged glances. One man in the third row quietly angled his phone and pressed record. Maria stepped in quickly. "Dean, we need to—" "I'm speaking," he said without looking at her. Keanu stayed seated, his voice quiet but steady. "If I've done something to offend you, I'd rather speak about it directly. Not like this." Dean scoffed. "You haven't done anything today. That's the problem." The silence grew heavier. From the economy cabin, an older man leaned toward his wife and whispered, "That pilot's got a grudge. You can see it in his eyes." She whispered back, "Why is he saying that in front of everyone?" Ashley, now watching from behind the galley curtain, exchanged a concerned glance with Maria. Turbulence shook the plane again, slightly harder this time. But the real storm had already started inside. The silence in the first-class cabin stretched thin like glass under pressure. No one dared speak. A few passengers lowered their tablets and slowly pulled out earbuds. Others simply watched, unsure if this was some strange in-flight announcement or something more serious. Dean's posture was rigid, his face set like stone. But beneath it was something more volatile, bitterness, and it was aimed straight at Keanu. Keanu remained seated, his expression calm but not passive. His gaze didn't challenge Dean's, but it didn't retreat either. "I don't know who you think I am," Keanu said quietly, "but I've never pretended to be anything." Dean's voice sharpened. "That's just it. You don't have to pretend. Everyone's already decided you're some kind of messiah in denim." Maria stepped in again, firmer this time. "Dean, we need you back in the cockpit. Now." Dean ignored her, his voice rising just enough for the nearby passengers to hear clearly. You know how many men I've flown who actually served something larger than themselves? Who risked everything without a camera watching? And yet they go home with nothing. You smile at a kid or help someone pick up their purse, and the world calls you a saint. Keanu slowly stood, not in defense, but to level the eye line between them. There was no malice in his body language, just dignity. I don't do things for headlines, he said. I don't need people to like me. I just try to do the right thing when I can. Dean stared at him, breathing heavily. Ashley stepped into the cabin now, seeing the situation escalating. Captain Chen is asking for you, Dean. He still didn't move. From the rear of first class, a woman called out softly, "Sir, please, we're all just trying to fly safely." Another voice added, "He hasn't said a single bad word to you. Why are you doing this?" Dean's eyes flicked around the cabin now as if realizing he'd stepped too far. His lips parted as if to justify himself, but nothing came out. Keanu's voice lowered again. "Whatever happened, whatever you're carrying, this isn't the way." There was a long pause, the kind of silence that felt like the entire plane was holding its breath. Then turbulence struck again, stronger this time. Luggage shifted in the bins above. A few passengers gasped. The plane trembled for 3 long seconds before steadying. Dean finally stepped back. Without another word, he turned on his heel and disappeared through the curtain, back toward the cockpit. Maria let out a slow breath and approached Keanu. "Are you all right?" He nodded. "I'm okay." But his eyes lingered on the closed curtain. Whatever that was, it wasn't over. The tension in the cabin lingered long after Dean vanished behind the curtain. Passengers whispered quietly, unsure whether to feel concerned or outraged. A few had kept their phones recording, instinctively sensing that something unusual, perhaps even dangerous, was happening on this flight. The air wasn't just tense, it felt fragile. Ashley bent down beside Keanu's seat again and gently handed him a fresh cup of tea, her voice almost apologetic. "I'm so sorry you had to deal with that." Keanu offered a soft, grateful nod. "It's not your fault." She hesitated. "He's never acted like that before." Keanu glanced at her. "It wasn't about me, not really." Ashley looked down. "Still, no one deserves that kind of attack." Just then, a tall man in business attire leaned forward from the next row. He spoke low enough not to draw attention, but loud enough to be heard by those near him. "That pilot's got something going on. You don't act like that without history." Across the aisle, the elderly couple from earlier nodded in agreement. The husband murmured, "He was trying to humiliate him. On purpose. There's no other way to explain it." Maria moved briskly through the cabin, checking on passengers and ensuring seatbelts were fastened again. She stopped at Keanu's row, took a breath, and leaned in. "We'll be contacting the captain. If you'd like to file a report after landing, I can..." Keanu shook his head gently. "Let's just keep everyone safe first." His response was calm but clear. He wasn't interested in drama. He wanted resolution, not escalation. Still, Maria could tell he was affected. Not angry, but deeply concerned. Not for his own dignity, but for what might be waiting deeper beneath Dean's outburst. She nodded and moved on. Up front, behind the closed cockpit door, Julia Chen was staring at her co-pilot. "That can't happen again," she said firmly. Dean sat in silence, one hand on the yoke, the other clenched on his thigh. She continued, "Whatever history you've got with that passenger, it ends now. You jeopardize the atmosphere of this flight again, I'll have no choice but to make a report when we land." Dean didn't look at her, he didn't speak, but the tension in his shoulders hadn't eased. Julia returned her attention to the instruments, her voice quieter now. "You've always been solid in the air. Don't destroy that because of something you won't talk about." Dean remained silent. Back in first class, the cabin had gone almost completely quiet. Passengers sat stiffly, eyes on the closed curtain, wondering if the strange episode was over or if something worse was building underneath. Keanu closed his eyes again, but this time his breath came slower, more deliberate. Outside, the clouds grew thicker. Inside, everyone waited for what would happen next, and not a single soul felt at ease. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft continued across the Pacific. A quiet calm returned, but it was uneasy. Conversations were softer now, restrained by the earlier tension. Some passengers tried to distract themselves with books or movies, but their eyes drifted often to the front of the plane. They were waiting for another outburst that hadn't come. Keanu sat quietly with a folded blanket across his lap, hands resting atop it, still and thoughtful. The teacup near his elbow remained untouched, the steam long gone. He stared forward, not at anyone or anything in particular, but into a quiet place within himself. Maria finally returned. She approached carefully, kneeling beside him so their conversation wouldn't carry. She looked around once, confirming the nearby passengers weren't listening, then spoke in a low, careful voice. "I thought you deserved to know," she began, "that what happened earlier wasn't really about you." Keanu turned to her with soft eyes, waiting. Maria glanced down, gathering her words. "Dean's younger brother, Kyle, he died about 10 years ago. Motorcycle accident. He was 23. Keanu's expression didn't shift dramatically, but something in him stilled even further. "And was obsessed with motorcycles," Maria continued. "Talked about them every day. Collected old gear. Wore a replica helmet from one of your movies. He even saved up to buy the same model of bike you once endorsed. That Norton." Keanu nodded slowly. "The Commando 961. "Yeah," Maria said. "That one. His brother used to tease him for it, call him Hollywood, but it was all in good fun back then. Kyle admired you, idolized you, I think. Not just for the movies. For how you carried yourself. Kind of like you made quiet cool." Keanu looked down at his hands. Maria lowered her voice even further. "When he died, Dean changed. Shut down emotionally, got more rigid, always professional, but something about him hardened. A few months later, he stopped flying for almost a year. No one really knew what happened. I only found out because we trained together." Keanu nodded again, listening intently. "I think," Maria added, "he blames you, not personally, but symbolically. Like you made motorcycles look noble. Like you romanticized danger. Kyle's bike lost control on a back road in Colorado, and I guess Dean couldn't let go of the image that someone inspired him to ride that fast." Keanu didn't speak. He just absorbed it, every word. Maria rested a hand gently on the seat beside him. "He's not a bad man, but he's never faced it, and when he saw you on this flight, I think something inside him cracked." Keanu's voice, when it came, was quiet. "Is he all right?" Maria looked at him, surprised. "You mean now?" "Yes," Keanu said simply. "Not if he's angry. If he's okay." Inside, Maria blinked, then lowered her gaze. "I don't think he's been okay for a long time." Keanu leaned back slightly, eyes unfocused as he absorbed Maria's words. The quiet around them filled with meaning. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even shocked. It was grief he understood, not because it was about him, but because he had lived it too. He had lost people. Too many. Friends, family, souls who left before their time, and he had asked himself the same questions Dean probably asked every day, the questions without answers. Maria stayed beside him, sensing he needed a moment to process. She watched the expression on his face shift, softening, grounding. Finally, Keanu spoke. "Do you know if Dean ever talked to anyone about it?" he asked. Maria hesitated. "Not that I know of. He keeps everything locked up. Won't even let people mention Kyle's name in the break room." Keanu looked out the window briefly. The clouds were thinning below. A faint horizon had started to form over the ocean's edge. "He's in pain," Keanu said quietly. "Yes," Maria replied, her voice dropping. "But it doesn't excuse what he did to you." "I'm not excusing it," Keanu said. I know what it feels like to carry something too long. To carry it alone." Maria nodded slowly. "You want to talk to him?" "I don't think he wants that," Keanu replied. "Probably not," she said with a faint, sad smile. Keanu sat forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But maybe he needs it." Maria sighed. "He might see it as pity." "Then I'll make sure he knows it isn't," Keanu said. "It's respect." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, after a pause, she said softly, "I've worked flights for 10 years. I've never seen someone respond to an attack like you did." "I wasn't attacked," Keanu replied gently. "He was drowning, and I happened to be close enough for him to reach." Maria gave him a look filled with quiet admiration. Before she could reply, the overhead lights blinked softly, indicating the crew's message system had been activated. A voice came through the cabin speakers. "Captain Julia Chen's. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making slight altitude adjustments to avoid weather disturbances ahead. We ask that you remain seated for the next 20 minutes. Thank you for your understanding." Maria stood, placing a hand briefly on Keanu's shoulder. "Thank you for listening." Keanu nodded, but didn't smile. She turned to leave, but before she stepped away, he asked, "Do you know what Kyle was like?" Maria stopped, thought for a moment. "Kind," she said, "a little wild. Big laugh. Said he wanted to ride all the way across the country one day." Keanu's voice softened. "Sounds like someone I would have liked to meet." Maria looked back at him. He thought he had, and with that, she quietly walked away. Keanu remained still as Maria disappeared down the aisle. He turned slowly back toward the window, but his eyes didn't focus on the sky anymore. They drifted inward, into memories of his own. He remembered River. He remembered his daughter, who never took a breath. He remembered nights walking empty streets, not because he was lost, but because he didn't know how to be found. Pain never left, it just changed shape. He closed his eyes and let that truth settle, and for the first time on this flight, his breath came deep, anchoring him to the moment, not as a passenger, not as a target, but as a man trying to understand another. In the galley up front, Maria whispered to Ashley, giving her a brief rundown of what she'd shared with Keanu. Ashley's eyes widened. "I had no idea. He never said a word." "I won't," Maria replied. "That's the problem." Back in the cockpit, Julia Chen continued navigating the storm systems ahead, but her attention kept drifting to Dean beside her. He hadn't said anything since his return, and his body language was still tight. One hand on the throttle, one on the control panel. Every muscle coiled. "Dean," she said gently, "if you need to step out for a few minutes again, I can handle things. Just say the word." "I'm fine," he replied, clipped and mechanical. Julia didn't press further, but in her mind the line had already been crossed, and she couldn't ignore it for long. Meanwhile, a quiet ripple of conversation began to stir throughout the aircraft. Word had begun to spread. Passengers from business class had heard pieces of the confrontation and were now whispering theories. Some defended Keanu, others speculated about the pilot's mental state. No one had a clear answer, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Near the middle of the plane, the elderly man from earlier looked over at his wife again. "You remember that movie where he saves the kid by jumping off the train?" he whispered. She chuckled softly. "I remember. He's not acting like a movie star now," he said. "He's acting like someone who knows what real loss feels like." She reached over and gently took his hand. Back in first class, Keanu finally opened the notebook from his carry-on. He wasn't sure what he was going to write, but he needed to move the weight from his chest to the page. He let the pen rest between his fingers for a moment. Then he began. A few rows behind, a man who had been silently observing leaned over to his wife and whispered, "If I were that pilot, I don't think I could look him in the eye again." His wife replied. Maybe that's exactly what he needs to do. Keanu kept writing. The turbulence had faded, but something deeper was still shaking. And they all knew it wasn't done unraveling yet. The hours passed quietly after the earlier turbulence. Somewhere between the coast of Alaska and the northern Pacific, the sky outside the aircraft darkened into soft twilight. Inside the cabin, most passengers had settled into silence, lulled by the rhythmic hum of the engines. Keanu hadn't moved much from his seat. His notebook remained open on the tray table, but his pen had been still for a while. His thoughts wandered far from the page, circling around what Maria had told him and the look on Dean's face during their encounter. There was something deeper than anger in the man's eyes. It was grief, trying to look tough. The soft chime of a crew message broke the stillness. A moment later, Maria returned to Keanu's row with a quiet voice. "Captain Shen would like to speak with you privately, if that's all right." Keanu looked up, surprised but not alarmed. He nodded gently and stood. Maria led him to the forward galley area, where a small private crew section had been cleared. Julia Chen stood waiting, arms folded, her expression a mix of professionalism and concern. "Thank you for coming up," she said. Keanu gave a polite nod. "Of course. I'll be brief," she said. "I reviewed the incident report Maria submitted, and I saw the footage a few passengers discreetly recorded. I also heard what happened in first class." Keanu listened without interruption. She continued, "Under normal procedure, I would be required to file an official report with the airline. Dean's actions, his tone, his words, and the setting in which he said them violate our professional code. And frankly, they could be interpreted as threatening." Keanu took a breath. "I understand." Julia studied him. "I wanted to ask you directly before I proceed. Do you want this escalated?" Keanu met her eyes calmly. "No." She blinked, slightly caught off guard. "No." He shook his head slowly. "Hurt people sometimes say hurtful things. That doesn't mean we return the pain." Julia was quiet for a moment. "What happened back there? It wasn't just inappropriate, it was personal." Keanu nodded. "It was. But it wasn't really about me. It was about something he hasn't healed from." The captain let the weight of his words settle. She wasn't used to this kind of response. Not in a world where complaints flew faster than apologies. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. "Because you have every right—" "Yes," Keanu interrupted, not with force but with clarity. "Let him carry one less burden. That's enough for me." Julia leaned against the wall of the narrow galley and let out a quiet exhale. "I wish more people thought like that." Keanu offered a half smile. "I'm just doing what I hoped someone would do for me." Julia looked at him, this time not just as a passenger or a celebrity, but as a man trying to do right by someone who didn't know how to ask for help. Captain Julia Chen stood quietly for a moment, arms crossed, considering the man in front of her. It wasn't that she didn't believe him, she did. But she had rarely seen someone offer that level of grace in such a tense and personal situation. "You know," she said slowly, "most people would have asked for an apology, or at the very least, a formal record." Keanu nodded once. "And that would have been fair, but I don't need it." Julia's gaze narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in curiosity. "Why?" Keanu's eyes didn't waver. "Because people lash out when they're in pain. If I push back, it just makes the pain louder. But if I leave room for them to breathe, sometimes they find their way out." The captain looked down briefly, digesting the meaning. "You've thought about this a lot," she said. He offered a small, solemn smile. "I've had reason to." She gave him a long look, then finally spoke again, quieter this time. "I'll note the incident in our internal log, but I'll mark it resolved, informal resolution, no escalation." Keanu nodded again. "Thank you. That's more than fair." Julia pushed off the wall and stood up straighter. I'll let Dean know you declined to report him." Keanu paused. "You don't have to do that." Her brows furrowed slightly. "You'd rather he not know?" "I'd rather he think about it," Keanu said gently. "Not out of guilt, just reflection. If he learns anything from this, it shouldn't be because someone forced him to." Julia slowly nodded in understanding. "You're trying to offer something back to him, aren't you?" "I'm trying not to take anything more," Keanu answered. The captain looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "You're a better man than most." "I'm just a man who's been on the other side of silence," Keanu said. "And I know how much noise a quiet act of mercy can make." She smiled faintly at that. "That might be the best line I've heard at 30,000 feet. He smiled back, just enough to show peace. She motioned toward the aisle. "You're free to return to your seat. We're expecting smoother skies for the next few hours." Keanu nodded. "Thank you, Captain." As he turned to walk away, Julia called after him one last time. "For what it's worth, I think Kyle would have been proud." He stopped briefly, taken aback. He didn't turn around, just stood there. "I think so too," he said softly. And then, without another word, he stepped back into the quiet cabin, where overhead lights glowed gently and passengers had begun to doze, unaware of the grace that had just passed, unseen between two strangers in the shadows of a flight path. As Keanu made his way back down the aisle, the hum of the engines filled the silence around him. He passed rows of quiet passengers wrapped in blankets, dim screens casting gentle blue light on their faces. No one looked up. No one knew what had just happened at the front of the aircraft, but it lingered in the air, the weight of a decision that had no ceremony, no applause, just quiet resolve. He slipped back into his seat, folding the blanket over his lap again. The flight attendant, Ashley, passed by and paused for a moment. She gave him a subtle nod, then continued on. It wasn't much, but it was enough to say she understood. Keanu rested his head back, closing his eyes. He wasn't exhausted, but his mind felt full. Of Kyle, of Dean, of the million small decisions people make to either pass on pain or break the chain. In the cockpit, Captain Julia Chen sat beside Dean in silence for several minutes. The storm systems on the radar had cleared. The sky ahead was open. Still, the tension in the air hadn't faded. She finally glanced over at him. Keanu declined to file a report. Dean's hands twitched slightly on the controls. Did he say why? She nodded. Said you were hurting, that it wasn't about him. Dean didn't respond at first. Then his jaw tightened. That doesn't make it right. No, she replied, but it says a lot about him. Dean's voice came quieter. He didn't have to do that. Julia looked at him carefully. No, he didn't. Which means you have a choice now, Dean. He didn't ask what choice, he knew. Back in first class, Keanu finally reached for his notebook again. This time, he flipped to a new page and wrote at the top in clean letters, Kyle. He paused, then wrote, I never met you, but I think I met your echo today. The words came slowly, but they came. The table says people die twice, once when their heart stops beating, and again when their name is spoken for the last time. Today, your name was spoken, quietly, but it mattered. He set the pen down and stared at the words for a long time. Elsewhere on the plane, Maria caught a glimpse of him writing. She didn't interrupt. She simply returned to her duties, moved in a way she couldn't fully explain. When Keanu finally closed the notebook, he looked around the cabin with calm eyes. The sky outside was beginning to lighten on the distant edge of morning. There were still hours to go before landing. But something had already arrived. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just in him. The flight continued, smooth, silent, and without spectacle. But beneath it all, the choice to forgive had already changed the direction of more than one life. Keanu stared out the airplane window as the world below blurred into soft, endless blue. But his mind was far from this flight. It drifted back to another kind of journey, one that started on two wheels and ended in silence. He was 19 when he first fell in love with motorcycles. It wasn't about speed, not really. It was about escape, about control, about the way the wind felt like forgiveness when it wrapped around you. Every ride gave him something he couldn't quite name, but always chased. The sound of the engine roaring beneath him, the road unraveling ahead. It was freedom, pure and untamed. He remembered his first bike, a beat-up Norton Commando he'd saved for 2 years to buy. It stalled more than it ran, but it taught him everything: how to fall, how to get back up, how to respect the machine, the road, and what it meant to be vulnerable while moving fast. And then there was Ray. Ray had been more than a riding buddy. He'd been like a brother. They met on a film set when Keanu was just breaking into the industry. Ray was a stunt coordinator, 10 years older, sharp-witted, fearless. They clicked instantly. Both lived fast, but Ray always had a calm center, like he knew something deeper about the world. They'd ride through the hills outside LA for hours. No destination, just movement. Sometimes they wouldn't talk at all, just the low rumble of two engines in harmony, winding through canyons and coastlines. Keanu remembered one ride in particular. It was fall, late afternoon. The sun was throwing gold across the asphalt. They pulled off the highway and sat overlooking the ocean. Ray lit a cigarette, took one drag, and said, "It's not about outrunning anything. It's about being part of something you can't control." Keanu never forgot that line. But freedom has a cost. A year later, on a rainy morning in Topanga Canyon, Ray lost control. A driver coming around the bend too fast, a slick patch of asphalt, one mistake, one moment. Gone. Keanu got the call while filming in New York. He flew back that same night and stood at the crash site the next morning before sunrise. The road was quiet. There were still skid marks. His boots pressed into the mud at the edge of the cliff where Ray's bike had skidded out. He didn't cry, not then. But the funeral, standing over Ray's grave in a leather jacket still soaked from the storm, that broke something in him. The cemetery was nearly empty. A few family members, a couple of crew guys. Keanu stayed long after everyone left, kneeling by the fresh dirt, fingers tracing the carved letters in stone. "I should have been there," he whispered, not to stop it, just so Ray wouldn't have been alone. The memory of Ray's funeral was one Keanu never spoke about publicly. There were no interviews, no tributes in magazines, just a vow he made that day in silence. He'd never ride carelessly again, and he'd never glamorize it. But life had other plans. A few years later, he was offered a film role where his character rode a custom cafe racer through city streets, helmet off, hair flying. The stunt team asked if he was comfortable with it. He hesitated, but eventually said yes. Not because he wanted to, but because he knew if he didn't do it, someone else would, and maybe they wouldn't understand the risk the way he did. He remembered watching the playback footage. The director had praised how cool it looked. Fans later called it iconic. But to Keanu, every second of that scene was a prayer. Every lean into a turn was a whisper to Ray's memory. Every wheel lift was a hope that some kid wouldn't try to copy it on a wet road. Still, the photos ended up on posters. The bike became a symbol. And as time passed, he began to see that symbol take on a life of its own. Letters came in from young fans, kids who had bought their first bikes because they saw him ride. Some thanked him. Some sent pictures of their motorcycles, grinning proudly. And with each letter, the knot in his stomach grew tighter. He remembered one in particular, a boy named Aaron, 19, from Georgia. "Dear Mr. Reeves, I saved for 2 years to get my bike, just like you did. I know it's risky, but something about it makes me feel alive. My parents are scared, but I told them if it's good enough for John Wick, it's good enough for me. There was no return address, just a signature and a Polaroid of a young man next to a blue Triumph. Keanu kept that letter. But weeks later, he saw a news segment. Georgia, motorcycle fatality, same model, same town. The face was blurred, but the weight in his chest said enough. After that, Keanu turned down 3 action scripts that required motorcycle stunts, not out of fear, but out of mourning. He couldn't carry another name, not when he didn't know how many already lived in the corners of his career. So when Maria told him about Kyle, Dean's younger brother, the boy who'd idolized Keanu and died riding a motorcycle like his, it wasn't just a stranger's tragedy. It was a mirror, a life caught in the same web of admiration, risk, and misunderstanding. One where Keanu had never meant to cause harm, but somehow left behind a shadow he couldn't trace or undo. And that realization didn't make him defensive. It made him quiet. A week after learning about Aaron, Keanu drove out alone to the cemetery where Ray was buried. It was late, nearly dusk, and the gates were just about to close. The groundskeeper recognized him but said nothing, just nodded and unlocked the side path leading to the older graves. Keanu found the headstone easily. He always did. The grass was overgrown. The flowers he'd placed months earlier had wilted into soft brown folds. He knelt down and brushed the dirt off the carved name. Raymond Keller, 1954-1987. Below it the line Ray had once quoted, "It's not about outrunning anything, it's about being part of something you can't control." Keanu sat there for a long time. No one around, just the rustling of nearby trees and the faint scent of pine in the evening air. "I think I understand you better now," he whispered. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photo. It was the Polaroid from Aaron's letter. He'd kept it all this time, tucked between journal pages, unsure what to do with it. Now, it felt right. He placed it at the base of Ray's headstone. "Two riders who never met," Keanu murmured, "but maybe you'll watch out for each other now." As the sun dipped behind the hills, the sky turned gold and rose. The kind of soft beauty that always seemed cruel when grief sat nearby. He didn't cry, not because he was holding back, but because the ache had turned to stillness. In that moment, a voice rose within him. Not dramatic, not loud, just clear. "I've always known the risk," it said. Keanu repeated it quietly to himself. "I've always known the risk. I just never knew who might carry the blame." And with that, something shifted. Not a release, not absolution, but a deeper understanding. Dean's pain, his resentment, it wasn't born out of malice. It was born from watching someone he loved chase an image he couldn't reach, and then vanish trying. Keanu understood now that it wasn't really him Dean hated. It was the illusion, the unreachable ideal. The silent guilt of not stopping his brother, of not being enough to save him. Keanu had carried his own guilt for years, quietly, privately, but never in anger. Instead, he had turned to reflection, to silence, to honoring names without speaking them aloud. And now here he was, thousands of feet above the ocean, sitting just rows away from someone who had turned that same pain into bitterness. The difference wasn't moral, it was choice. And Keanu chose empathy. As he leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, the memory of Ray faded into the glow of the present. Not erased, just softened. The plane flew on. But for Keanu, the real journey was inward. One where forgiveness wasn't just offered to others. It had to start with himself. The captain's voice came over the intercom with a calm professionalism that only thinly veiled the urgency behind her words. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to rapidly developing weather patterns ahead and concerns over turbulence beyond our flight path, we will be diverting to Anchorage for an unscheduled landing. Estimated time to touchdown is 27 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." There was a ripple of murmurs through the cabin, followed by a hush that settled like mist. Keanu opened his eyes slowly, registering the change in tone and energy. He glanced out the window. The sky outside had darkened, heavy clouds swallowing the fading blue. The wing tipped gently as the plane began its slow descent. Flight attendants moved briskly, securing carts and checking seatbelts. The lights flickered briefly as the cabin pressure shifted. A baby began to cry in economy. The young mother from the boarding gate, now visibly tired and holding her half-asleep toddler, patted her son's back with a strained rhythm, trying to soothe him. Keanu didn't speak. He sat upright, hands folded in his lap, eyes alert but calm. The landing itself was bumpy but controlled. As the plane touched down on the icy tarmac, a thin veil of snow streaked across the windows. Outside, floodlights revealed a runway, dusted in white. Everything looked foreign and hushed. Once they taxied to a stop, the captain came back on the speaker. "We'll be deplaning shortly due to the extended delay. The terminal is small but warm. We'll provide updates as soon as we have them. Thank you for your patience." Passengers slowly stood, stretching limbs, gathering bags, shrugging on coats. Keanu reached for his only carry-on, a simple, worn duffel bag, and waited patiently in the aisle. The toddler in front of him was starting to fuss again. The mother, now juggling her coat, a backpack, and a child's blanket, looked overwhelmed. As they stepped into the cold air between the aircraft and the small terminal, the first gust hit like a wall. Sharp, icy wind whipped through the space between shuttle carts and stair rails. People gasped. A few struggled to keep their scarves in place. Without hesitation, Keanu removed his own coat and draped it gently around the woman's shoulders. She blinked, startled. "I'm okay," she said quickly, though her voice trembled. "You've got a little one," Keanu replied softly. "You need it more than I do." She didn't argue. Her eyes softened with gratitude. "Thank you." Keanu just smiled and continued walking, wearing only his dark sweater now, hands tucked in his pockets. They entered the terminal, a compact utilitarian building with fluorescent lights, rows of plastic chairs, and vending machines lining the far wall. It was warmer, but the mood was colder now. Fatigue had set in. Dean walked in last, his face tight. He scanned the crowd and saw Keanu by the windows, then quickly looked away. No words passed, just a flicker of tension beneath the surface. The terminal wasn't built for this many passengers. People shuffled around, trying to find somewhere to sit, stretch, or charge a phone. The snow outside had picked up, swirling in a slow, persistent dance that made the windows look like frozen watercolor. Keanu found a quiet corner near a broken vending machine. He sat his bag down and stood by the window, gazing out at the runway. Beyond the glass, ground crew moved like shadows under bright halogen lights. The sky above was a deep, slate gray, heavy with silence. The codeless chill was creeping in, but he didn't seem to mind. Across the room, the young mother had settled into a chair with her toddler asleep on her chest, bundled beneath Keanu's coat. A few passengers noticed and whispered. One man tapped his wife gently and pointed. She smiled, then took a photo discreetly, not of Keanu, but of the mother and child wrapped in warmth. Dean sat near the staff check-in desk, away from the passengers. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the floor. A flight attendant approached him, murmuring something, but he waved her off. His shoulders were tense, jaw clenched. Maria, the attendant who had confided in Keanu earlier, noticed both men. She hesitated for a moment, then made her way to Keanu. "You okay?" she asked quietly. He nodded once, still looking out the window. "You didn't have to give her your coat," she added, glancing toward the sleeping toddler. "She needed it more than I did," he replied. "Simple choice." Maria nodded, then shifted, lowering her voice further. "Dean's not doing well." "I know," Keanu said softly. "I saw it the moment we boarded." There was a pause between them. The hum of fluorescent lights above filled the gap. "He's been carrying that pain for years," she said. It's carved into him. "I've seen that kind of weight," Keanu murmured. "In others. In myself." Maria watched him for a long second. "You're not what I expected." "I get that a lot," he said with a faint smile. She didn't push further, just offered a quiet thank you, then walked away to check on other passengers. The hours dragged. Airline representatives updated passengers about connecting flights, estimated departure times, and local hotels. Most of the information was vague. No one was going anywhere anytime soon. Keanu remained by the window, watching the snow stack against the corners of the glass, each flake falling like a memory. Dean eventually stood up. He walked slowly through the crowd, pausing for a coffee from a machine that spat more steam than drink. When he passed Keanu, their eyes met briefly. Dean didn't speak. Keanu gave him a small nod. Dean looked away and kept walking. It wasn't confrontation, but it wasn't peace either. Just two men standing on opposite ends of a quiet storm. An announcement came over the terminal's intercom, static guilled and tired. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're sorry for the delay. Weather conditions are being monitored closely. A decision on reboarding will be made within the hour. We appreciate your continued patience." There was a shared sigh across the terminal. A few passengers groaned. Some checked their watches or phones for the 10th time. Keanu simply stood up from his corner and stretched, rolling his shoulders. He walked quietly toward the small restroom hallway, but halfway there, he changed direction. The terminal doors to the outside were automatic. They whooshed open with a cold blast of air the moment he stepped near. A security officer raised an eyebrow, but didn't stop him. Keanu didn't go far. Just outside, onto the small concrete walkway near the service vehicles. Snow fell in steady lines now. Thicker. Quieter. He stood still. "You're not looking at anything. Just breathing." The cold wrapped around him like a familiar voice. It didn't sting. It settled. Footsteps echoed behind him, slow and uncertain. Dean. He had followed him out, maybe unintentionally, maybe not. He didn't speak right away. The wind did most of the talking. For a long time, it was just two silhouettes, standing in the pale orange glow of an airport floodlight, surrounded by snow. "You know," Dean said eventually, his voice gruff but not sharp, "I always wondered what I'd say if I ever saw you in person." Keanu turned slightly, not surprised. "And now that I have, I still don't know." Keanu didn't force the moment. He simply said, "You don't have to." Dean crossed his arms, rubbed his fingers together for warmth. "My brother was obsessed with your movies. Thought riding a bike made him invincible." Keanu looked down, nodding slowly. "I've heard that before." Dean scoffed under his breath. "Of course you have. Guys like you get letters, fame, tributes. I get regrets," Keanu said quietly. "And graves." The wind picked up, scattering loose snow at their feet. Dean didn't reply right away, but his stance changed. Slightly softer, less defensive. "I blamed you," Dean said. "I told myself if you hadn't been in those movies, he wouldn't have..." He stopped, shook his head. "But deep down, I knew it wasn't your fault. It was just easier." Keanu didn't move. Dean looked away, jaw tight. He was 17. I was the one who bought him the bike. I was the one who should have told him to slow down. Keanu finally turned fully to face him. "You loved him. That's why it hurts." Dean swallowed hard, eyes shining but unbroken. For a moment, it seemed like the world stopped around them. No grand speeches, just two men standing in the cold, carrying different versions of the same loss. Behind them, the airport doors opened again. A staff member called out for boarding to resume. Keanu and Dean both turned to look, then back at each other. No handshake, no dramatic ending, just a nod, and a quiet understanding. Dean stood there, hands buried in the pockets of his uniform jacket, shoulders stiff against the wind. Snow had started collecting on his sleeves, but he didn't move. His jaw was locked, his breath visible in short, sharp bursts. Keanu stood a few feet away, still without a coat, still silent. Neither of them broke the silence for a long time. Then Dean spoke, his voice low and edged. "You ruined my brother." The words hit the air like a slap. Keanu didn't flinch. Dean took a step closer. "He watched all your movies, the ones with the bikes, the guns, the impossible stunts. Thought you were untouchable. Thought riding made him invincible." Keanu kept his eyes steady, not defensive, not apologetic, just present. "I told him," Dean continued, his voice rising slightly, "I told him it was just a movie, that no one walks away from a wreck like that. But he wanted to be you, he wanted to ride like you, so when he got that bike, the same model you rode in that action scene, he thought he was flying." Dean's voice cracked, just for a second. Hit a turn too fast, skidded into a barrier. I got the call at work. Spent 3 hours trying to figure out how to tell our parents that their youngest son was lying on a coroner's table in pieces. Keanu lowered his gaze briefly, absorbing it. "You didn't know him," Dean said, trying to steady his voice. "But he knew you, and you didn't even know he died." "I do now," Keanu said quietly. Dean laughed, bitter. "Yeah, now you do, big deal." Keanu stepped closer, still calm. "I'm not going to defend something I didn't say or do. I've never told anyone that motorcycles are safe. I've never promised anyone they wouldn't fall." Dean shook his head, the cold tightening his features. "But you made it look like they could fly." There was no anger in Keanu's next words, only depth. "Because sometimes, for people like your brother, for people like me, riding was the only time we felt free." Dean looked like he wanted to interrupt, but something stopped him. Maybe the way Keanu said it, maybe the way his voice didn't waver. "I've lost people too," Keanu continued. "A friend, a mentor, all to the same road. I've crashed hard enough to question if I'd ever walk again. And I've carried that guilt even when it wasn't mine." Dean turned slightly, facing the runway now. His hands trembled inside his pockets. He didn't speak. Keanu let the silence hang before adding, "Your brother didn't die because of me. He died doing something he thought made him feel alive." Dean's head lowered, breath shaking. "And if I gave him that feeling, if, for even one moment, he felt like the world made sense while he rode, I won't apologize for that. I will honor it." Dean's jaw tightened again, but this time his shoulders dropped, just barely. His voice came out quieter. "You really believe that?" Keanu nodded once. "I do." Dean stayed quiet, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the snow blurred into sky. He looked like he was wrestling with something deeper than anger now. Maybe regret. Maybe the weight of years spent blaming the wrong person just to give his pain a name. "My parents never rode again after he died," Dean finally said, his voice low. "They sold his bike, burned his posters, refused to say your name. They needed something to blame." Keanu nodded slowly. "Grief needs a direction. Otherwise, it eats you from the inside." Dean let out a breath, long and slow, clouding the cold air. "I didn't even realize how deep it went until I saw you sitting there, in that seat, just existing, like none of it mattered." "I'm sorry for your loss," Keanu said softly. "Truly, I wish I'd known." Dean looked at him finally. "Why didn't you report me?" "After what I said on that flight, I deserved it." Keanu didn't hesitate. "Because hurting people doesn't make me feel better. Carrying more bitterness doesn't help anyone." Dean blinked, almost confused by the answer. "So, what then? You just forgive me?" "No," Keanu said gently. "I understand you." Those 4 words hung in the air like a balm. Dean opened his mouth, then closed it again. He turned away for a moment, then back. His voice was different now, less clipped, less armored. "My brother's name was Ethan," he said. Keanu nodded, his tone matching the reverence. "Tell me about him." Dean hesitated, but something cracked open. "He was smart, quieter than me, obsessed with engines. Took apart our family's lawnmower just to see how it worked. He watched your movies with this belief that one day he'd matter." Keanu stayed still, listening. The snow continued falling. "Had this little notebook," Dean went on, "filled it with drawings of bikes and movie stunts. Said one day he'd ride across the whole country, alone. Just him and the road." Keanu smiled faintly. "That sounds like someone who loved the freedom more than the destination." Dean swallowed. "Yeah." Another moment passed. Then Keanu asked, "Do you still ride?" Dean shook his head. "Haven't touched a bike in 12 years. Keanu looked back toward the runway. "Maybe someday, when it feels right, you should." "Not for him, not for me, for you." Dean gave a short laugh. "You think that's what he'd want?" "I think he'd want you to stop being frozen in the moment he left." That landed hard. Dean's eyes flickered. Not tears, not exactly, but something wet enough to blur the lights ahead. The terminal door opened behind them. A flight attendant stepped out and called into the wind, "We're reboarding now." Dean didn't move right away. Keanu gave him space, just a nod, then started walking back toward the doors. Halfway there, Dean called out behind him, "Hey, Keanu!" He turned. Dean's voice was rough, but real. "Thanks for listening." Keanu didn't smile. He just placed a hand over his heart for a brief second. A gesture without words. Then both men walked inside. The storm outside didn't feel quite as heavy anymore. The cabin lights had dimmed, casting a soft glow over the rows of tired passengers. Some were already asleep. Others watched movies or read quietly. Keanu sat back in his seat, staring at the folded napkin on his tray table. In his hand, a simple pen the flight attendant had given him. He tapped it once against the edge of the tray, then began to write. The words came slowly, deliberately. "I don't know if this will help. Maybe it won't. But I've learned over the years that some things are better written than said. When I was 27, I lost a friend in a crash. We had just wrapped a film and he asked to borrow my bike. I hesitated. It was raining. I told him to be careful. He smiled and said, 'Always.' He didn't come back." Keanu paused. His eyes flicked to the window, where the faint moonlight shimmered over the wing. He continued writing. "I blamed myself for a long time, not because I handed him the keys, but because I had been the one who introduced him to the thrill of riding in the first place. I taught him how to shift his weight in a turn. I showed him how to feel the road like it was part of his body. I made it look easy. After his death, I didn't ride for a year. I stored the bike in a garage. Every time I passed it, it felt like a tombstone. I questioned everything, what I did, what I stood for, even who I was." He let the pen hover over the page for a moment before continuing. "But eventually, I realized something. He didn't ride because of me. He rode because it made him feel alive, just like it does for me. And the truth is, the road doesn't promise safety. It only offers clarity. For some of us, that's enough." Keanu paused again. The flight attendant, Maria, walked by and glanced at him. He offered a small nod, then looked back at his letter. "You said your brother looked up to me. That's a heavy thing to carry. I don't take it lightly. But I want you to know, I never meant to be a symbol. I'm just a man who stumbled through a lot of loss, trying to do a little good where I can. We don't get to choose how people see us, but we can choose what we do with the pain they leave behind." He took a breath, then signed it simply. "Keanu." He folded the napkin carefully and placed it into a small envelope Maria had brought earlier. Sealing it, he looked up and caught her eye. "Would you mind giving this to Dean?" he asked, quietly. Maria took it gently, no questions asked, just a hand over her heart as acknowledgement. She walked back toward the crew quarters, pausing briefly at the cockpit before stepping inside. Keanu leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, the hum of the engines filling the silence now. The letter was out of his hands, but what mattered had already been said. Dean sat in the cockpit reviewing the revised flight plan while Captain Julia Chen handled radio communications. The storm had passed, and the route to Tokyo had reopened. Outside, the snowy tarmac glistened beneath airport lights, but inside, a strange stillness had taken hold. Maria entered with quiet steps, holding the envelope in one hand. She didn't say a word, just extended it toward Dean. He looked up, confused, then noticed the handwriting on the front. His brows furrowed. Maria said softly, "From Keanu." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and left, letting the cockpit door swing gently behind her. Dean hesitated. His first instinct was to set the envelope aside, but something stopped him. He turned it over in his hands, fingers brushing the flap. He opened it carefully, unfolding the napkin inside. The ink had slightly smudged from the recycled paper, but the words were clear. He read slowly, each line, each pause. At first, his face showed restraint, the same measured professionalism he wore during flight checks and pre-takeoff announcements. But as he read further, something shifted. His shoulders dropped, his lips parted slightly, and his fingers curled around the napkin's edge, as if holding something delicate, vulnerable. When he reached the end, he sat still for a long time. The hum of the cockpit instruments filled the silence. Outside, a de-icing truck passed by with a low, mechanical groan. Dean barely noticed. He folded the napkin again, this time with care. Not like a crumpled receipt or a throwaway message. He folded it the way someone folds a photo of someone they've lost. Gently, respectfully. He tucked it into the inner pocket of his uniform, right above his heart. Captain Chen glanced over. She noticed the change in his expression, but didn't intrude. "Everything good?" Dean cleared his throat. "Yeah, just processing." She nodded. "We're clear to depart when you're ready." Dean looked out the window, then reached for the controls. His hand hovered for a moment. Then he spoke, not to her, not officially, just aloud. "I used to think forgiveness was weakness," he said. "But maybe it's just the beginning of something else." Captain Chen said nothing. She didn't need to. Dean flicked a switch, adjusted the throttle, and began the final checklist. Back in the cabin, Keanu opened his eyes as the engines roared back to life. Passengers stirred as the plane began to taxi. Maria passed him once more, giving him a quiet look. Not a smile, not a nod, just a glance, filled with something more profound. Something understood. Keanu looked ahead, then out the window. Snowflakes still drifted beyond the glass, but the sky had started to clear. Somewhere, up above the storm, there would be light. And this time, when the plane rose from the ground, there was no tension, no scowl, no anger clinging to the cabin like frost. There was only air, and the sense that somehow two men had taken off lighter than when they'd landed. It started with a blurry clip, less than 30 seconds long, shot on a passenger's phone from several rows back. The angle was shaky, the audio muffled, but the content was unmistakable. Dean Carraway's angry voice slicing through the quiet luxury of first class. The tension in his words, the raw, pointed hostility. And then, Keanu Reeves. Not retaliating, not raising his voice. Just sitting calmly, his posture still, eyes focused, his face not hurt, but open. Compassionate. It was that stillness, so rare in a world obsessed with comebacks and clapbacks, that stunned the internet. The clip was posted by a woman seated 2 rows behind. She added a short caption. "Pilot goes off on Keanu Reeves mid-flight. His response? Class." By the time the plane landed in Tokyo, it had already crossed 1 million views. Within hours, it exploded. News outlets picked it up, dissecting the footage. Online forums buzzed. Podcasts speculated on the context. Armchair experts offered their theories. But what they all agreed on, what no one could ignore, was Keanu's restraint. His grace under fire. His refusal to escalate when most would have snapped back. Headlines appeared everywhere. Keanu keeps his cool at 30,000 feet. Celebrity shamed on flight responds with unshakable dignity. Pilot's rage, actor's grace, a masterclass in humility. Even people who hadn't watched a Keanu movie in years were suddenly talking about him again, sharing quotes from past interviews, reposting older acts of kindness. Someone dug up an old charity donation he'd made anonymously. Another recirculated a video of him giving up his subway seat in New York. The incident on the plane became a symbol, not of scandal, but of restraint, of maturity, of choosing empathy over ego. Meanwhile, Keanu said nothing. His team received interview requests, morning shows, late-night talk shows, columnists, bloggers, all eager for a soundbite. But Keanu declined every one. No statements, no Twitter posts, no explanations, just silence. He had already said everything he needed to on that flight, and in the letter he had written afterward. Some people speculated that his silence was strategic, that it added to the mystique. But those who truly understood him knew better. Keanu wasn't silent because he had something to hide. He was silent because he had already made peace. With Dean. With the past. With the moment itself. Let others shout. He'd keep walking. Back in Los Angeles, his publicist received dozens of voicemails from journalists looking to verify the identity of the pilot. But Keanu never gave Dean's name. He never pointed fingers, never asked for anyone to be punished. The woman who had posted the video followed up days later with a second post. I spoke with a flight attendant from that trip. She said Keanu wrote the pilot a letter. Didn't yell, didn't accuse, just connected. Can you imagine that? That post went even more viral than the video itself. People weren't just reacting to drama, they were reacting to transformation. In a culture addicted to outrage, here was a story of restraint. In a sea of call-outs, here was a whisper of grace. In the days that followed, the ripple effect of that single flight extended far beyond the usual celebrity headlines. A high school ethics teacher in Vermont used the video in her classroom, asking her students to debate the power of silence over confrontation. A therapist in Seattle wrote a blog post titled, "When Grace Meets Grief," citing the clip as a rare modern example of emotional discipline. A pastor in Tennessee referenced Keanu's quiet strength in his Sunday sermon, comparing it to turning the other cheek, not out of weakness, but out of inner peace. Even other celebrities took notice. A retired actor posted, "Been in that first-class cabin before. Trust me, it's not easy staying calm when someone attacks you publicly." What Keanu did? That was strength. A well-known musician reposted the clip with the words, "Grace doesn't trend often, let's make it trend today." The clip was translated into multiple languages. International news channels aired segments on it. Viewers in Japan, Brazil, South Korea, and France were all asking the same question: why didn't Keanu fight back? The answers came in waves from viewers around the world. Because not every battle needs a battlefield. Because real strength looks like stillness. Because you can carry someone's pain without carrying their hate. Keanu, however, remained detached from the frenzy. While the internet unpacked every frame of his calm expression, he was already off doing what he always did, spending quiet hours with friends, checking in on charities, reading scripts in small cafes where no one bothered him. When asked by a friend if he planned to respond publicly, he only smiled and said, "If Dean ever wants to talk, he knows where to find me." That was enough. But perhaps the most surprising reaction came from within the airline itself. 2 weeks later, an internal memo was circulated by Captain Julia Chen. In it, she didn't mention names nor cite the incident directly. Instead, she spoke of the responsibility of flight crews, not just in safety, but in emotional professionalism. She reminded everyone that passengers aren't just seat numbers, they're stories. And sometimes, they carry more than luggage. Dean received a copy of that memo. He read it in the crew lounge alone. No one said a word to him. No one needed to. He knew what it meant. Later that evening, Dean logged onto the airline's internal system and filed his own statement. He didn't argue. He didn't justify. He simply wrote that he had allowed unresolved grief to cloud his judgment, and that he owed one passenger a debt of respect he could never repay in full. He closed with, "I'm learning, slowly, but I'm learning." The world never saw that message, but the world didn't need to, because sometimes the most important conversations happen in quiet places, between two people, between two hearts. And sometimes the most viral moment isn't the outburst that makes headlines, but the silence that follows when someone chooses to listen instead of shout. Keanu never chased the story, but the story found him. And in doing so, it reminded millions that even at 30,000 feet, humility can still rise above the clouds. The morning after the clip went viral, the airline's headquarters in Chicago was a flurry of urgent meetings and panicked voices. A conference room filled with senior executives, HR directors, legal counsel, and the public relations team scrambled to contain what they feared could turn into a corporate disaster. The PR director, Laura Fielding, was already on her second espresso by 7 a.m. She clicked through social media posts, all showing variations of the same clip: Dean's public outburst and Keanu's quiet restraint. The trending hashtags were multiplying: Grace at 30,000, Keanu class, pilot meltdown. "This is a reputational nightmare," Laura muttered, rubbing her temples. Across the table, the head of HR spoke up. "We need to make an immediate decision on Dean Caraway. We've already received formal complaints from 3 passengers and 1 flight attendant." A legal advisor chimed in. "Given the visibility of the incident, it's risky not to act decisively. We have union considerations, but if we delay accountability, it could look like we condone aggression." Another exec added, "This isn't just about the pilot. The whole brand image is now linked to this moment." There was a heavy silence in the room until Laura stood. "Draft the suspension, pending investigation. We'll inform Dean after we review his employment record and get an official statement. But we need to move." Just as she sat down, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then froze. Everyone noticed. "Is something wrong?" one asked. Laura's voice dropped. "It's Keanu Reeves. His team just reached out. He wants to speak with us directly." They stared. "Is this a legal complaint?" the legal advisor asked. Laura shook her head. "No. He's requesting a private call, not with press. Just with us." The room fell into an uneasy hush. They had braced for a public denouncement, a major lawsuit, or at the very least a scorched earth celebrity statement. But a quiet call? That wasn't part of the usual playbook. 2 hours later, they were in a smaller conference room, this time with a secure video link. Keanu appeared on screen. No assistants, no publicist, just him. He looked calm, not rehearsed, not angry. He greeted them politely, thanked them for their time. Laura introduced the team, then cautiously said, "Mr. Reeves, I want to start by saying we take what happened very seriously. Our flight crew behavior." Keanu raised a hand, gently. "I'm not here to talk about punishment," he said. "I'm here to talk about pain." The room quieted. Keanu continued, "I've had time to think. I've read the comments, seen the headlines. But that's not what matters. What matters is that there's a man working for your airline who's carrying more than he should. That's not your fault, and it's not mine. But if we respond to pain with more pain, nothing changes." The general counsel adjusted in her seat, unsure what direction this was heading. Keanu leaned forward. I'm not asking you to ignore it. I'm asking you to see it differently. Don't punish pain, heal it. That's what I'd want if it were me. The executives exchanged glances, some visibly moved, others still trying to process the shift from crisis to compassion. Laura leaned in slightly, her voice softer now. With all due respect, Mr. Reeves, this has become a major public relations situation. The public expects action. If we do nothing, it may look like we're choosing favoritism or weakness. Keanu's voice didn't waver. Then let the public be surprised. Let them see that healing is stronger than retribution. The head of HR cleared his throat. Do you mean you want us to keep Dean on the job? Keanu paused, then replied, I want you to have the conversation he clearly hasn't been able to have. Give him space to reflect, to grieve properly, not just discipline him and move on. I'm not suggesting you do nothing. I'm suggesting you don't make punishment the whole story. The legal advisor spoke again, this time more cautiously. Are you asking us not to suspend him? I'm asking you to treat him like a human being first and an employee second, Keanu said. He didn't lash out at me because I'm a passenger. He lashed out because I reminded him of something he hadn't made peace with. The words sat in the air for a moment like something sacred. Then Keanu added something else, unexpected. If it helps, I'm willing to participate in one of your crew training workshops. Not as a celebrity, not as a spokesman, just as a person who's made mistakes and learned from pain. I don't need to be paid. I just want it to be real. You could hear a pin drop. The executives were stunned. An A-list actor offering to help, not with press conferences or red carpet photo ops, but by sitting in a closed room and quietly speaking to employees about empathy? Laura finally broke the silence. You'd really do that? Keanu nodded. Only if it's useful, not as a stunt, just as something human. Captain Julia Chen, who had been looped into the call silently from her base, finally spoke for the first time. Dean's not a bad pilot. He's actually one of the best I've flown with, but I've seen the burden he carries. What happened wasn't right. But I think what you're offering might be exactly what he needs. Keanu offered a faint smile. We all need reminders of who we are beneath our pain. The meeting ended not with signatures or legal notices, but with quiet gratitude. No headlines were written about that call. No press releases were issued. But internally, something shifted. Instead of immediate suspension, the airline placed Dean on paid leave and enrolled him in a new restorative leadership program. Quietly. No social media mention, no finger-pointing. Keanu never spoke of the call publicly. But a month later, the airline launched a new internal initiative called Altitude with Empathy. It included a training module on communication under pressure, emotional fatigue in flight staff, and personal bias awareness. In a small breakout session in Denver, a room full of pilots and attendants sat in silence as Keanu Reeves, hoodie, jeans, and soft-spoken, shared his story about the friend he lost, the grief he carried, and the choice he made to listen instead of fight. No cameras, no applause, just a man choosing healing over noise, and a room of people learning how to do the same. Keanu didn't tell anyone where he was going, not even his assistant. After his flight returned from Anchorage and he slipped through the terminal mostly unnoticed, he rented a modest car and drove north. No paparazzi, no escort, no headlines trailing behind him. It was a cool gray morning outside Sacramento, and the roads twisted quietly toward a rural cemetery nestled between oak trees and silence. He had found the name through a private search, Mark Carraway, Dean's younger brother. The obituary didn't mention much, just that Mark had died in a motorcycle accident at the age of 23, survived by his brother, Dean. There were no interviews, no news clips, only a small line that read, "He loved the wind and the road." Keanu parked by the stone wall and stepped out with his hands in his coat pockets. Tucked in his left palm was something small and metal. His first motorcycle key, the one he had kept since the 90s. The one he hadn't touched in over a decade, but never could bring himself to throw away. Today, it had purpose. The grave was near the edge of the hill, beneath a sloping pine. The grass was well kept. The headstone, simple. Mark R. Carraway, 1977-2000. He chased the road until the road stopped. Keanu stood still for a long time, saying nothing. The only sound was a distant crow and the rustle of dry leaves across stone. Then, slowly, he knelt. He placed the key gently against the granite, just above the engraved letters. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant for anyone but Mark. "I'm sorry," Keanu whispered. "Not for the bikes, but for the silence afterward. No one should have to carry that weight alone." He remained there, crouched by the stone, head bowed. He didn't hear the footsteps until they were close. Dean stood a few feet away, his eyes red from travel or maybe something more. He had driven 6 hours after receiving a quiet text forwarded through Captain Julia. The message hadn't said much, just a location and time. Part of him hadn't planned to come. But his car turned itself onto the road. He hadn't expected to see Keanu there first. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then Dean broke the silence. "I didn't know you even remembered him." Keanu looked up, not startled, only calm. "I didn't know his name until yesterday, but I never forgot the letter he wrote." Dean's face shifted. "You got one too?" he asked softly. Keanu nodded. "A fan letter, just a paragraph. He said my films made him feel free, that the bikes were never about danger. They were about control, about trying to outrun something that kept chasing him." Dean swallowed hard. "He never showed me that." "I probably didn't know how," Keanu said. "Some things are too big to say out loud." Dean walked closer, until he stood beside the grave. He looked down and saw the key. His lip trembled just slightly. "The one from your first, Norton?" Keanu gave a faint smile. "Yeah, it's been with me longer than most friendships. Figured it deserved a better resting place than my drawer." Dean nodded slowly. Then, after a pause, he said something that surprised even him. "I blamed you for everything, for years." Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't apologize either. He just waited, letting Dean speak without judgment. "I thought," Dean continued, "if you hadn't glamorized it, if he hadn't watched your movies on repeat, followed every quote, saved up for the exact same bike, maybe he wouldn't have gotten on that road that night. Maybe he'd still be here." Keanu looked out at the horizon behind the cemetery. The sky was pale and endless. "I used to think like that too," he said. "When my friend Paul died, I went down a dark hole of what-ifs. If I'd ridden with him that day, maybe I could have stopped it. If I hadn't told him that trail was worth the ride, maybe he wouldn't have pushed so hard. But blame is a cruel kind of anchor." Dean's breath was shallow. He knelt down beside the stone, his fingers brushing lightly over his brother's name. "I miss him every day," he said, "but I couldn't say his name without hearing yours in my head. Until now." Keanu looked down at the key once more. "I didn't come here for closure," he said. "I came to offer something back. Whatever Mark saw in my films or my face, that wasn't mine to control. But honoring him, even now, that still is." Dean stared at the headstone. His voice cracked. "I spent so long resenting you, I forgot who he was." He wasn't angry. He was restless. He needed the road, needed the risk, even when I begged him to stop. Keanu sat down on the grass beside Dean. No cameras, no headlines, just two men sitting with their grief and finally with understanding. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. Dean's tone softened. "I always thought being a pilot would make me feel in control, but the truth is, I've been flying to escape. I thought if I stayed in the sky long enough, maybe the pain couldn't catch up. Keanu nodded. It always does. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it means it matters. Dean finally turned to him, his expression more open than it had been in years. I don't think I'm ready to forgive myself, but I think I'm ready to stop running. That's the first step, Keanu said. The rest takes time. Dean stood slowly, brushing his hands off on his pants, then looked back down at the key on the grave. Thank you, he said, voice barely audible. Keanu didn't answer. He didn't need to. Together, they stood in silence for another few minutes before parting ways. Dean walked back toward his car, his steps lighter than they had been in a long time. Keanu lingered just a little longer. Then, with a final glance at Mark's name, he turned and made his way down the hill. No headlines would capture what happened there. But something had shifted, and that was enough. 3 months had passed since that quiet morning at the grave. The world kept spinning. Headlines faded, and social media moved on to its next obsession. But for Keanu, the memory of that cemetery hill never left him. Neither did the moment Dean knelt beside him and finally allowed the truth to breathe. Grief had met grace, and both men had walked away lighter. Now Keanu was at LAX again. No red carpet, no PR staff. Just him in a soft gray hoodie, a black backpack slung over one shoulder, and a ticket to Vancouver in hand. There was a small indie film shoot waiting for him up north. Something about fathers and sons reconciling across generations. The irony wasn't lost on him. As he moved through the terminal, a few people glanced his way, whispering, but didn't interrupt. The world had learned something from that viral video. Keanu valued stillness, privacy, and kindness most of all. At the gate, the announcement came. Flight 1132 to Vancouver, boarding now. Keanu walked calmly onto the jet bridge, stepping into the aircraft with practiced ease. A smiling flight attendant greeted him, her voice warm and familiar. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reeves." He nodded, gently, thankful as always for people who saw him but didn't make a scene. As he walked down the first-class aisle, he froze for half a second. Not in fear, not in discomfort, but in recognition. There, just outside the cockpit door, stood Captain Dean Caraway. He was dressed in full uniform, cap on, posture straight. But the hardness in his shoulders was gone. The sharpness in his jaw had softened. His eyes were clearer now, still intense, but no longer haunted. Dean saw him. For a brief moment, time hung between them. Then Dean nodded, just once, his expression solemn and full of something more than apology. Respect. Keanu returned the nod with a small smile, then took his seat. A few minutes later, as the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway, the cabin speakers crackled to life. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. My name is Dean Caraway, and I'll be guiding us on our short flight to Vancouver today." There was the usual shuffle of attention as passengers paused to listen. Dean continued, "But before we take off, I'd like to say something that may not be part of the standard script." Keanu's eyes lifted from the window. This flight is dedicated to anyone who's ever made a mistake they didn't know how to fix, and to those learning how to forgive, starting with myself. A hush fell over the cabin. You never know who's sitting quietly in the seat beside you, what they've lost, what they carry. So today, may we all carry a little less. For a long beat, no one said anything. Even the hum of the engines seemed quieter. Then, slowly, a few passengers looked toward Keanu, realizing what had just happened. One man in business class blinked, whispered, "That's the guy from that video." Keanu didn't react. He just looked ahead, eyes glistening slightly. He reached into his coat pocket and gently rubbed the corner of a folded piece of paper, the one Mark had sent him decades ago. The ink was fading now, but the words still held weight. "You make me feel like I can move again." The plane lifted off gently, smoothed through the clouds, and Keanu closed his eyes as the sun streaked across the window beside him. There was something peaceful about this flight, not just because the skies were calm, but because something else had finally settled inside him. Across the cockpit door, Dean sat in silence. His hands rested steady on the controls, but his mind returned again and again to the cemetery, to the moment he saw Keanu kneel beside his brother's grave and leave that small, worn motorcycle key like a tribute. Not for show, not for redemption, just a man choosing to carry someone else's sorrow, even when it wasn't his to bear. Dean had replayed their final conversation over and over. None of us ever really know what another person carries. It had taken him years to realize that grief doesn't always sound like screaming. Sometimes it walks beside you quietly, invisible to everyone but those who've met it too. And now, Dean wasn't trying to escape the sky anymore. He was flying towards something. Something on. At cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed slightly. The passengers settled into their routines. Movies, earbuds, open books. But a subtle shift in atmosphere lingered. The captain's words still echoed in their minds. A middle-aged woman leaned over to her husband. "Did you hear what the pilot said?" she whispered. He nodded. "Sounds like he went through something." A flight attendant moved quietly down the aisle with a water tray. When she reached Keanu, she hesitated, then gently set a bottle on his tray table. "I remember Anchorage," she said softly, almost not daring to speak. Keanu looked up. Her name tag read Maria. He smiled, remembering her from the last flight, the one where everything changed. "I never forgot," she added. "What you did, how you handled it. It made some of us think about things differently." Keanu simply nodded. "It wasn't about me." Maria's eyes glistened. "But it changed him." She moved on, and Keanu looked out the window again, watching the clouds roll past like slow waves. He could almost feel Mark's voice in the back of his mind. Young, restless, full of hunger for life. He thought about how easily stories twist when they're told from one angle. How years of blame had grown in Dean like ivy, choking out the truth, all because no one had ever helped him pull it back far enough to see the light. Forgiveness didn't always start with a handshake or an apology. Sometimes it began with silence, with a key on a stone, with a man choosing not to retaliate, but to listen. As the plane began its descent into Vancouver, Keanu felt a strange sensation. Not fear, not excitement, something closer to ease, something that had eluded him for years. They touched down gently, the tires skimming the runway with a quiet hiss. The brakes whispered, the engines slowed. And then, just before the seatbelt sign dinged off, the intercom came on once more. Dean's voice, softer this time. "To the man in seat 2A, thank you for reminding me that the past doesn't have to hold us hostage. That sometimes, kindness is louder than rage." A pause. "And thank you, Mark." Keanu's breath caught. The passengers looked around, some with surprise, others simply moved by the honesty in that voice. But Keanu just sat still, one hand over his heart, the other gently pressing that old folded letter in his coat. He didn't need a headline. He didn't need applause. He had something better: peace. The sun was just beginning to rise over the hills of Santa Clarita when the ribbon was tied to the wooden archway. Below it, in freshly painted red letters, the name read clearly, the Mark Carraway Center for Rider Awareness and Safety. It wasn't a large place, just 3 converted hangars beside an old retired airstrip, but it had everything it needed: classrooms, a closed-course track, and, most importantly, the kind of staff who believed in purpose over polish. Keanu stood quietly beside a modest podium, sunglasses tucked into the collar of his black shirt. Around him, a small crowd of families, local riders, and safety instructors had gathered. Journalists had been invited, but only a few arrived. This wasn't meant to be a media spectacle. This was something else entirely. Dean Caraway stood just to Keanu's left. The same man who once held years of silent fury now stood with his hands calmly folded, head slightly bowed. His uniform was off today. He wore a gray sweater and jeans, looking less like a pilot and more like someone who had finally landed. For weeks after that flight to Vancouver, Dean had wrestled with guilt and grace. He'd replayed every moment between them, from the outburst in first class to the long silence in Alaska, the note, the grave, the second flight. But it was when Keanu called him directly, weeks later, with the idea of the school, that something finally broke free. "I want to build something that makes your brother's name stand for more than a tragedy," Keanu had said. "I want people to learn before they mourn." Dean hadn't known what to say. He just listened, then said yes. Now, in front of the modest crowd, a small plaque was unveiled. It read, "In memory of those who rode free and those who loved them." The words echoed across the silent courtyard. Keanu took a few steps forward and spoke, his voice steady, thoughtful. "I've loved motorcycles most of my life. They gave me a sense of movement when my world felt stuck. But they've also taken people I cared about, and for years I never talked about that side of it. The cost." He paused, looking at the young faces in the crowd, some wearing leather jackets, others just holding helmets, hopeful and unaware. "This place is about second chances, not just for writers, but for families, for people who carry stories that were never finished." He turned to Dean, and for a moment neither man spoke. Then Keanu stepped aside, gesturing for Dean to join him at the podium. Dean hesitated. He wasn't a public speaker, but he owed something to the moment, to the brother he'd spent so long grieving in silence. He stepped forward, cleared his throat, and looked out at the crowd. "My brother Mark loved motorcycles because they made him feel alive. He didn't die trying to be reckless. He died chasing the freedom we all talk about but rarely understand." He glanced at Keanu again. "For a long time, I blamed someone who didn't deserve it. I thought, if I could hold someone responsible, the loss would hurt less." Dean looked down at the plaque, then back at the crowd. "But pain doesn't go away that way. It just changes shape. What helped me heal was realizing that sometimes honoring someone means building something better in their name." A quiet round of applause followed. Not loud, not staged, just sincere. After the speeches, the crowd slowly dispersed into the open hangar. Inside, young riders gathered near the classroom space, where posters lined the walls with bold messages. "Ride smart, ride free, and helmet first always." One corner displayed framed photographs of riders who had lost their lives, not in shame, but in memory. Mark Caraway's picture stood at the center, smiling, young, full of energy. Dean stood silently before it, eyes fixed. He reached out and adjusted the corner of the frame, his fingers trembling just slightly. Keanu joined him a moment later, watching without saying a word. "I still don't know what he was thinking that day," Dean said quietly. "He was just a kid. I didn't even know he followed you like that. Posters on the wall, that same exact Ducati you endorsed." Keanu nodded. He wasn't alone. A lot of young guys saw the style, the freedom. We don't always realize how deep the impression goes. Dean turned to him, eyes searching. "Do you regret it?" Keanu thought for a moment. "No, but I carry it. And that's why we're here." Dean looked back at the photo. He would have loved this place. "I hope it helps someone like him walk away from the edge," Keanu said. "Maybe then it's worth it." Later that afternoon, the first safety course began. A small group of riders, men and women, some in their 20s, others older, lined up at the edge of the practice course. Instructors guided them through low-speed maneuvers, braking drills, and emergency handling exercises. It was basic, but foundational. From a bench nearby, Keanu and Dean watched quietly. "You know," Dean said after a while, "I used to think grief made me strong. Like, if I stayed angry, it meant I still cared." Keanu looked at him. "But it didn't make me strong," Dean continued. "It made me hard, closed off. And eventually, it started taking more than it ever gave. Keanu replied softly. Forgiveness isn't weakness, it's clarity. And sometimes, it's the only thing that lets us move again. The sound of a bike tipping over drew their attention. A young woman had lost balance on the corner and fell sideways. She got up laughing, unhurt, brushing off her jeans. One of the instructors helped her lift the bike again. Her father, standing near the gate, clapped and cheered, proud of her spirit. Dean smiled for the first time that day. That's the kind of falling we can live with. Keanu smiled too. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting a warm golden hue across the lot, a final group gathered near the memorial stone. Each person was handed a small card with a rider's name, a stranger, a family member, a friend. One by one, they placed the cards beneath the plaque. Dean stepped forward last. His card simply said, "Mark, you still ride with me." He placed it beneath the others, stood in silence, then turned back toward Keanu. I spent years wishing someone had told me the truth sooner, that maybe I could have saved him. Keanu's response was gentle. Sometimes the truth takes time to find, and sometimes it finds us when we're finally ready to carry it. Dean nodded, letting the words settle. Around them, the wind stirred lightly. Flags fluttered, engines cooled, and something unseen, something old and heavy, seemed to lift. Not completely, but enough. The coffee shop sat on a quiet side street in Silver Lake. No neon signs, no line out the door, just the smell of roasted beans and the soft clink of cups behind the counter. It was the kind of place people came to disappear into their thoughts, which was exactly why Keanu liked it. He arrived first, sat at a small corner table near the window. A worn, leather-bound notebook sat beside his cup of black coffee, pages creased from use. He didn't write today. He just waited. The bell above the door jingled. Dean Carraway stepped in, dressed in a simple navy jacket, looking around with the faint unease of someone still learning how to slow down. He spotted Keanu and gave a small nod. Keanu stood, extended a hand. "Good to see you, Dean." Dean shook it, firm but not forced. Likewise. They sat across from each other. No cameras, no phones, no statements to make. Dean ordered a drip coffee, no sugar. The barista brought it over a few minutes later, and they sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't demand filling. "I almost didn't come," Dean said eventually, hands wrapped around his mug. "Not because I didn't want to, just I didn't know what I'd say." Keanu smiled faintly. "You showed up, that's enough." Dean looked at him, studied his face, the calm beneath the surface. "You forgave me," he said quietly. "Before I even knew I was sorry." Keanu didn't respond right away. He took a sip of his coffee, then set it down carefully. "That's how healing begins," he said. "Not with the apology, but with the space to offer one." Dean looked down, then back up. "I thought about that flight a lot. That moment in first class. The things I said, the way I acted." Keanu's voice was gentle. "You were carrying something that needed a place to go. I took it out on you. I could see that." Dean chuckled once, dry and self-deprecating. "You could have ruined me. Called for my suspension. I would have deserved it." "I didn't want revenge," Keanu said. "I wanted clarity." Dean leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You're not what I expected, Keanu." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," Dean admitted. "Movie star. Aloof. Maybe someone who would act polite in public and cold in private. But instead, you—" He paused, searching for the words. "You saw through the anger." Keanu gave a small nod. "Because I've felt it. Not the same as yours, but I've held on to guilt, let it twist things." They sat for a while, letting the coffee cool between their hands. Dean looked out the window. "After my brother died, I felt like the world owed me something. A reason, an apology, someone to blame. I told myself that if I could just point a finger, maybe the pain would stop eating me alive. Keanu leaned forward slightly. And did it? No, Dean said, shaking his head. It made it worse. The more I blamed others, the less I could forgive myself for not protecting him. Keanu's voice softened. He made his own choices. You don't have to carry all of them. Dean blinked, as if those words hit deeper than he'd expected. Dean let the weight of those words settle. For the first time in years, he felt something loosen inside, not vanish, but shift, like a knot slowly unraveling. He glanced at Keanu, who sat quietly, not pressing, not judging, just present. And that made all the difference. You know, Dean said after a while, my brother used to tape your interviews. He'd rewatch them, like they were sermons, especially the ones where you talked about loss, pain, trying to live a quiet life. Keanu's lips curled into a soft smile. He sounds like he was thoughtful. Suppose. Wild but thoughtful. Dean paused. He looked up to you, not just for the motorcycles, for how you kept showing up, even after everything you went through. Keanu stirred his cup gently. It means something to be remembered like that, even if I didn't know it at the time. Dean stared at the small swirl in his coffee. That's what finally broke me. Realizing that he didn't die trying to be you, he died trying to be free. He loved the wind, the road, the feeling of being untouchable. It was never about danger, it was about living. Keanu nodded slowly. That's why I still ride. Not to tempt fate. To remember what it feels like to breathe without boundaries. Dean looked up, eyes shining. Thank you, not just for forgiving me, for seeing my brother, for honoring him in a way I couldn't. You honored him too, Keanu replied, by carrying his memory, even when it hurt. Dean exhaled. I think I'm ready to carry it differently now. They both sat in stillness again, not because they had nothing more to say, but because some things didn't need words. Outside, the sky had turned gold with late afternoon light. The clatter of cups, soft jazz on the radio, and the hum of a milk steamer filled the background. Eventually, Dean reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He placed it on the table. It was a picture of his brother, laughing, helmet in hand, standing beside a blue Norton Commando. Young, fearless, full of life. Keanu studied the photo for a long moment. He had your eyes. Dean swallowed hard. Yeah. I wish I'd told him how proud I was. Before Keanu looked up. Maybe you still can, in the way you live, in how you teach others. That's school. It's not just for riders. It's for the brothers who never got to say goodbye. Dean's voice caught in his throat. You really believe that? Keanu's expression didn't waver. I have to. Otherwise, what was all this for? Dean nodded, tears held back by a thin wall of composure. It's enough. They stood, the conversation finished but not forgotten. Dean reached out first this time and they shook hands again. No tension, no old weight. Just respect. Before parting, Keanu turned back. If you ever want to ride again, I know some quiet roads, beautiful ones. No press, no speed, just the sound of the wind. Dean smiled. Maybe I will. Keanu walked out first, the small bell above the cafe door chiming as he disappeared into the evening. Dean stayed a few minutes longer, staring down at the photograph, then folding it carefully back into his coat pocket. He was no longer a man trapped in grief. He was a man beginning again. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional crunch of leaves under Keanu's boots. Early morning mist clung to the trail like a soft veil, diffusing the light into something gentle, almost sacred. His hands were tucked in his coat pockets, but one held something. A folded, faded pamphlet. The corners were worn, the ink smudged by time and fingerprints. On the cover was a simple drawing, a helmet, a winding road, and a small signature at the bottom, his friend's name. He'd found it again by accident. It had been tucked between pages of an old journal, one he hadn't opened in years. The safety pamphlet had been a passion project, a way to keep young writers informed, inspired, and maybe just a little safer. Keanu had dismissed it at the time. "No one reads these," he had joked. But his friend had smiled, saying, "Maybe one person will, and maybe that's enough." Now, all these years later, the weight of that idea felt heavier. Not in a burdensome way, but in a way that made him pause, breathe, remember. He reached a bench beneath a large sycamore tree, its branches stretching over the trail like open arms. He sat slowly, still holding the pamphlet. Across the path, a young father knelt beside his daughter. She was maybe 6, legs shaky on a small pink bicycle with training wheels. Her helmet was too big, and her shoelaces trailed on the ground. But her eyes sparkled with determination. "Ready?" the father asked. She nodded, gripping the handlebars tight. As he gave her a gentle push, she wobbled, steadied, then squealed with joy as she rolled forward. He jogged behind her, hands ready to catch her if she fell. Keanu watched silently, a soft smile forming. He didn't know them, didn't need to. The scene was familiar enough, a beginning, a moment of trust, a lesson not just in balance, but in letting go. He glanced down at the pamphlet again, then unfolded it. Inside were short paragraphs about cornering safely, how to read weather patterns, why to wear gloves even in the heat, and at the very bottom, a note in his friend's handwriting. "The road teaches you more than speed. It teaches you to stop, to notice, to remember why you ride." He traced the sentence with his finger. Forgiveness had come slowly, over years, for others, for himself, for the things that weren't his fault but still felt like they were. He had learned that sometimes grief didn't leave, it just changed shape. And that healing wasn't loud, it was quiet, private. Like this trail, like this moment. A breeze rustled the leaves overhead and Keanu closed his eyes. His voice, soft and reflective, played through the memory of that morning. The road teaches us more than speed. It teaches us to stop, to notice, and sometimes to forgive someone who never asked to be. He opened his eyes again. The little girl had tipped over onto the grass. Her father rushed over, scooping her up gently. She was laughing, not upset, just thrilled that she'd tried, that she'd dared. And her father, he was smiling too. Not because she'd succeeded, but because she was okay. Because they were there, together. Keanu stood up, brushing off the bench. He folded the pamphlet one last time and tucked it back into his coat, not to hide it, to carry it forward. As Keanu walked further down the trail, the gravel shifted beneath his steps, every sound a soft echo in the calm. A squirrel darted across the path ahead, disappearing into the brush. The forest felt like a sanctuary. Not because it was untouched, but because it reminded him that life continued, gently, despite the weight people carried. He thought about Dean, not the angry man who lashed out in the sky, not the one who avoided eye contact at the terminal, but the man who stood beside him at a grave, who watched his brother's name carved into stone and didn't speak, because words would have only collapsed under the emotion. Forgiveness didn't erase pain. It didn't excuse cruelty, but it turned the blade sideways, made the wounds stop cutting deeper. Keanu remembered the moment Dean whispered, "I didn't know." Those 3 words had been heavier than any insult he'd thrown, and Keanu's response hadn't been scripted. It came from a truth he'd long held close. None of us ever really do. We walk through life assuming we understand, when in reality, most of us are just trying to make sense of what hurts. That understanding is what led to the coffee shop conversation. A quiet table, no paparazzi, no social media check-ins, Just two men, once trapped in their own pain, now sitting in the light. "You forgave me before I even knew I was sorry," Dean had said. And Keanu had nodded, not out of pride, but peace. That's how healing begins. He paused at another bend in the trail, looking up through the branches. Patches of sky blinked between the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of distant laughter floated. Someone else enjoying the same stillness. That, too, felt sacred. He thought about the Rider Safety School, the plaque bearing Dean's brother's name, the kids who would learn how to handle their machines not as weapons, but as tools of joy. It hadn't been a grand gesture. It had been necessary. Quiet, a gift, not a performance. Dean hadn't said much at the ceremony, but his presence had spoken volumes. Standing beside Keanu, hands folded in front of him, eyes fixed on the dedication, he hadn't needed to explain anything. Grief had shifted into purpose. That was the quiet miracle of it all. Keanu took out the pamphlet again, smoothed it once more. Then gently he placed it in a small crevice in the bench under a stone. Not to discard it, but to leave it for someone else. Maybe a writer. Maybe a father. Maybe just someone who needed to slow down. He stepped away, the trees parting before him. In the final moments of the trail, Keanu's voice returned. If you're still carrying something heavy, maybe it's not yours to hold anymore. Maybe it's time to put it down. Or to carry it differently. The road won't forget what happened, but it might forgive how long you carried it alone. He stopped one last time and turned around. The trail was empty, but he knew someone would come. Someone always did. Call to action. Have you ever had to forgive someone before they were ready? Tell us your story in the comments. We want to hear from you. And let us know, what do you want to see Keanu do next?